Welcome to this episode of Did You Know? I'm your host, Rabbi Ira Brower.
And I'm your co-host, Trysten Tice.
Yeah, and so today we're going to kind of follow up from our last episode where we talked about Purim. And while Purim is a fun time to celebrate, and we have costume contests and dress up and read the story of Esther and so on. But there's a real important spiritual dynamic that is reflected in that book, which has to do with the attempt of Haman to destroy the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so we could look at that and say, well, there's a real case of anti-Semitism there, right? Hatred for the Jews, which is what anti-Semitism is.
And it clearly didn't just go away and stop then, because there is obviously still anti-Semitism going on today.
Exactly, right. It didn't start then and it didn't end then.
Right.
And so as we look throughout history, whether it's back in biblical days or in days of Yeshua and going forward, there's always been this attack or this attempt to destroy the Jewish people. And so the good question is, why?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. Where did this start and where did this come from?
And so I think it would be good to talk about some of the spiritual dynamics behind it. So we can look at the history, and a lot of people don't know, even in the church world, the history of anti-Semitism in the church that has been, since the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. We could spend a lot of time on that.
Right.
But why is it that there's always been this, whether it's within the church or outside, an attempt, and today, in the Islamic, radical Islam and so on, to destroy the Jewish people?
It really, basically, the ultimate question of why are the Jewish people always being persecuted?
Yeah.
And what is the answer?
Yeah. So I think that we can start with maybe what I would say the bigger picture, right? Mm-hmm. So who are the Jewish people? What do they exist? Why do they exist? Why do we exist, right?
Yeah. Great question. So here's my answer. Hopefully I get a point here, but I would say we exist because of Abraham. We are descendants from Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Let's go.
Right?
Let's go.
So God made a covenant,
yes.
right, with Abraham, and was passed down to Isaac and passed down to Jacob. And the covenant basically says, I give you this land. A nation, land, and a promise, right? The promise is that through your descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Those that bless you will be blessed. Those that curse you will be cursed. Right? It starts there. Mm-hmm. And then if we follow that all throughout biblical history and beyond, we see this warfare going on all the time to destroy what God promised to Abraham and his descendants. Right? We see it in Egypt, with slavery in Egypt.
Right.
We see it through the Babylonian exile. We see it through the Roman conquer, destruction of the first temple, the second temple. Going forward from Jesus' day, we see it in the church world where the idea that...
in the Holocaust.
The pogroms, the Holocaust, the Inquisition. It's a whole big topic that we could talk about. In Spain and Portugal, also attempt to destroy the Jewish people, to separate the Jewish people from God, from the truth of the scriptures, and so many things, and many books, and been written about all that, the history, and on and on and on. But if you boil it down, which is kind of like what I felt like we could talk about today more so, is the spiritual dynamic behind all of that, which is what? I mean, who is behind all that? And of course, Satan. Yeah, is behind all that. And of course, he shows up in the garden to start with, right?
In the snake.
In the snake, right? And so, what was his purpose there? If you go back right to Genesis chapter 3, where he rises up, Well, it was to separate
from God.
man from God out of jealousy. And when you think about it, that is his MO, isn't it?
So true. It's constantly trying to separate us from God in any way he can through division.
Right. So, as far as Israel and the Jewish people, God called the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, going forward, right, to be what?
The chosen people.
Chosen people to do what?
To have a nation and be blessed and in relationship with God.
And to do what as far as the other nations?
Be an example.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I got it right. To be a light to the nations.
Yes.
That is a consistent theme of God's calling upon Israel, starting from Exodus 19, going through, the time of coming into the land, that all the nations of the land, of the nations around, would see what a good God Israel serves, and they would also want to serve.
And we've talked
God
about that in other episodes.
We have.
Other gods would constantly have a work-based relationship where you have to keep working and working to earn your way to God. And God said, there's a day of rest. He gave a Sabbath.
Yeah.
So God was always this gracious, kind, compassionate God versus other gods that other, people served.
So on the spiritual side of it, we think about the gods of the nations, right? So each nation had its own god,
right?
And they worshiped them. What were those gods? Well,
like Baal.
Like Baal,
and
like
Asherah.
Moloch, like Asherah, and all the rest. They were idols, the physical idols, right? Statues, let's say. Now, what we could say, well, they're nothing but statues. But really, there's a demonic entity that's behind each one of those.
Okay, I always wondered that. I always wondered, are they real or are they not real? Because as soon as, let's say this cup was Baal and you're worshiping Baal, I'd be like, it's just a cup. It's not anything. But then why do they believe it so fully? There must have been something going on for all these people to believe something.
Right. So there's a scripture in Deuteronomy 32 that it says that God scattered the nations, right? In the original text, it's the gods were scattered, the divine beings were scattered. So there's an interpretation that says that there was a divine council of God, with God, and then at the fall, he not only cast out the man, but he cast out those divine beings and assigned them each to one of the 70 nations.
So that's like the rules and principalities.
Correct.
This is so cool. I have never heard this ever.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, continue.
So on the one hand, we could say, yeah, well, they're just statues. They're nothing, right? Wood and stone, which is true. However, in the spirit realm, we believe that there is a demonic, a spiritual entity that is behind those things, okay? All right, so what does that have to do with anti-Semitism?
Right.
Well, the highest rulers and authorities, their highest assignment, if you will, is to destroy the Jewish people. Why? Why is that such a high-level assignment?
Because they're chosen, and then that would be separation from God, and then they lose the example of what it is to be in a relationship with God, and then everyone's separated from God.
Right, and it makes God out to be a liar.
Wow, but yet, because the Bible says the devil's native tongue is a liar, and he uses deception.
He's the father of lies, yeah.
And looks like an angel of light.
Yeah,
it's all making sense. Okay.
Yeah, so if he can be successful in destroying the Jewish people, then God's a liar.
Right.
Right. So how does he go about that? Well, he uses humans like he always does. He uses humans, planting lies. Even going back to the first century, after the destruction of the temple, in the now evolving mostly Gentile church, right? Because the Jewish believers were cut off. They were forced to either choose to go back to Judaism or renounce their Jewishness to be part of the now emerging church, right?
Right.
So talking about like the 2nd century, let's say, end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, this started. So what was behind all that? Well, it was a lie that because the Jewish people rejected Jesus, therefore God now rejects them.
Okay.
And that becomes the basis for the legitimization of anti-Semitism within the now evolving Gentile church, Christian church. So it's okay because they're rejected by God. That's the basis for the Inquisition, the basis for the Holocaust, the basis of all pretty much anti-Semitism since the 1st century. As the Jews killed Christ, they're rejected people now, and it's okay to kill them, persecute them, cast them off as second-class citizens.
So then, what then happens? I don't know if this veers off a little bit, then bring it back if not.
Okay,
but
that's fine.
What then happens to the Jewish people if that is the case, that Jewish people did reject Jesus? That doesn't mean God rejected them and broke his covenant.
That's correct.
Doesn't go back on a covenant.
That's correct.
But then what does that mean for Jewish people? Like, basically, does it make sense to evangelize to Jewish people then if they're already going to be saved, or if God never ended their covenant in the first place?
Right. Well, that's a really good question. So, of course, Paul said, has God cast off his people whom he foreknew? May it never be. God forbid, he said. Romans 11, right? So you said it correctly. Just because Jewish people have not received Yeshua, or in fact rejected him, although many did receive him, of course, we know,
Yes.
historically in the 1st century, it was the leadership that rejected him.
Yeah.
Right? And leadership have rejected him ever since, and therefore the people have followed suit. Given that, though, doesn't mean God has rejected them, because, like you said, God is a God who keeps his covenant.
Yeah. He's not a liar.
He's
he
not a
keeps
liar.
his promises.
Right. Satan's the liar.
Yes.
And that's what he wants people to believe. Well, exactly this, right? Well, because Jews rejected Jesus, therefore God has rejected them. No, he hasn't rejected them.
There will still be a place for them at the end.
Right. Because even Yeshua in Matthew 23, he wept over Jerusalem, and he said, how I long for you to receive me, but you will not see me again till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which clearly implies that there is going to be that moment where they do accept him. And
they're saved.
And they turn to Yeshua. So it's clearly, and some interpreters say that when he's weeping over Jerusalem, he says, oh, Jerusalem, he's really weeping over the leadership, because the leadership is focused in Jerusalem, the capital. That's where the decision was made to reject him.
Interesting. So then does it make sense to be evangelizing to Jewish people if they're already going to be saved at a last chance?
Yes, of course, because Paul's example is throughout is to the Jew first.
Yeah, so we're meant to still be preaching the message to them.
Yeah.
It just, I guess in my mind, I'm like, well, if they're already going to be saved at a last chance anyways, then what is the point in trying to tell them?
That's a little, a seed of a lie.
Yeah.
Right? That,
if I'm thinking that, I figure someone out there listening has got to think that way too.
Well, you could take that one step further and say, well, I believe that God's going to save who he wants to save.
Okay,
so
fair.
I don't have to share it with anyone.
And if I'm predestined, then God's going to make me do everything.
Yeah.
But
so that's
master.
the extreme of covenant.
Sometimes I'm an extreme person.
Covenant theology.
I'm like, well, then don't do it.
Yeah. You said the word.
Predestination.
Covenant theology.
Yeah.
Where it says, well, God's going to save who he wants to save.
Right.
So But yeah, no, we're called, even Paul said, the gospel is to the Jew first, Romans 1:16.
Right.
And he did it by his life example of going to the synagogues wherever he went, even though he himself was called as a minister to the Gentiles.
Right. So he was preaching to Jewish people too, which means
yes, always.
We're always that too.
Wherever he went. So, so the notion that, Jews don't need Jesus because they have the Old Testament. There's some theology that says that as well, or saved under the Old Covenant.
Right.
And then that's not true.
That's not true either. I think Paul gave that verse that was like, if you're saved by the law, you'll die by the law.
Right.
Like you can't uphold it to be saved by the law because that's a works-based salvation, which isn't true.
Right. Exactly.
So anti-Semitism and how that all plays a role.
And so, and there's different flavors of it, so to speak, right? So we could talk about the Muslim terrorism, Islamic extremism, that hatred of Jews from that, of that sphere, of that, stripe, so to speak. That kind of does go back to what you said earlier, which is Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael.
Yeah. That was off camera, but we did talk about that. Basically, Abraham is the father of Ishmael, who was with Hagar, and also the father of Isaac, who was with Sarah, but that was the child of the promise with Sarah versus out of the flesh with Hagar.
Yes.
If that makes sense for your following.
Yes. And it's one of those kind of mysteries of God, right?
It's an interesting one. I've been thinking about that a lot this week, actually. But
yeah. God promised Abraham he'd have the son, right? But he, they couldn't wait. Sarah couldn't wait, so
she said she was old and laughed at God.
Yeah.
So then she was like, "Oh, go sleep with my servant Hagar," and he did. And then Hagar was sent away, even though it was Abraham and Sarah's fault. Like they're the ones that told her to do it.
Right.
She goes into the wilderness and calls God El Roy, the God who sees me.
Right. And God told Abraham to let her go.
Yeah. And didn't God tell Hagar, like, you'll have a nation through you?
Yeah. Yeah. He blessed her and said that you will have a nation through you.
Which are the Muslim people?
Well, which are the Arab people.
Okay.
The descendants. Not all Muslims are Arabs.
Okay.
The descendants of Ishmael. And unfortunately, that has created its own sphere of, anti-Jewishness through, Muhammad, who came much later, of course, from Ishmael, and developed his own, religion called Islam.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting because, I've been to Israel quite a bit, and I have some Arab Christian friends, and they're awesome, and there are Arab Muslims who, and I've seen on Facebook and on other social media, that are pro-Israel as well. So these Islamic extremists don't speak for all Arabs or all Muslims even. But it's enough percentage of the overall that creates this horrible situation.
So would you say that anti-Semitism goes all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, or?
Well, the Islamic flavor, so to speak, of it, yes, I would say goes back to that. But then you have Christian anti-Semitism.
Very true.
So,
which is interesting because I'll be honest, and I think this could be helpful to add, but I've never experienced Christians who are anti-Semitic. Perhaps you have, but I've never experienced Christians that don't love the Jewish people.
I haven't so much, but I think the more outward anti-Semitism that's been within the church goes back historically to earlier times.
Right.
For sure, like the Inquisition, which takes place in the 1400s, where, a third of
like leave your
Jews,
Judaism.
Yeah, they're either forced to convert or expelled or killed. Many thousands of Jews were killed by the Catholic Church at the time, right? So But even and if we talk about the anti-Semitism in the church, even Martin Luther wrote a horrible paper called "On the Jews and Their Lies," and he said, "What are we going to do with all these Jews? We're going to have to round them up and put them in the synagogues and burn the synagogues down."
Martin Luther wrote this?
Yeah. So Martin Luther,
I had no idea.
when he first, wrote his 99 Theses or whatever it was called, was hopeful that Jewish people would come along with him.
Yeah.
Right. But when they didn't, he became very bitter towards Jews. And towards the end of his life, he wrote this famous paper on the Jews and their lies, and he called them all kinds of horrible names and things. Martin Luther, John Calvin, all the Chrysostom, St. Augustine.
I have never heard that.
We could do a whole episode on that.
That'd be interesting, I think, because I've never heard that.
I think a lot of Christians don't know anything about that kind of stuff.
No.
But more Jews know about those things than Christians oftentimes. Yeah. And that creates that barrier to believing in Jesus.
And I've remembered, my Jewish friends saying things like, oh, like Christians are horrible and they're anti-Semitic and they're against me. And I've always just been like, that's not true. Like, we love the Jewish people. My church that I go to and here at Shalom Boca and many, I can't think of one that doesn't, but many congregations I feel are so embracing and accepting of Jewish people that have accepted Jesus,
right,
and the Jewish people without accepting Jesus, because we just love them.
Yeah, so we would say, a true follower of Yeshua would, by definition, almost have to love the Jewish people.
Be a light.
Because he himself is Jewish, right?
God's kindness.
So you can't love Yeshua and hate his people.
Exactly.
Right.
That's always what I've been so confused by.
However, it's been that way, historically it's been there, and there's a lot of great books that expose that. And there's more subtle forms even within the church, such as what we call replacement theology.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a good topic for an episode as well.
I do too.
So I think we probably
many
covered
things
what
there.
we need to.
Have you ever experienced anything that was anti-Semitism in your life?
Well, when I was a kid growing up in New York, Christ killers, I didn't even know what that meant. But, I've heard it.
Yeah. I know for me personally, I haven't ever experienced anti-Semitism either growing up. I don't know, like anything like that, but I definitely have compassion for people that have. Because there was a girl in my high school who had like swastikas painted in her locker. Or there were also like swastikas that were on one of the bathroom doors, and that got out to people, not, towards her, but just on one of the doors. So it's very prevalent, 100%, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and again, in the modern flavor of anti-Semitism, we have what's called the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. On college campuses, there's so much indoctrination and propaganda, and we see it since October 7th. There's on college campuses this whole idea of the Jewish people committing genocide against Arabs, which in most cases they have no idea what's really going on there, and the history and so forth. So, but it's horrible, really, and some of this rise of anti-Semitism now, just since October 7th. College campuses, a lot of Palestinians here, Arabs, Muslims that live in the United States that have spoken out against Israel, against Jews recently, and a lot of horrible things happening. So, hate to end on that note, but let's end on a more positive note, and that is that in spite of the anti-Semitism, in spite of that spiritual dynamic of satanic and demonic that is behind that, let's remember that God's love for the Jewish people is never ended. Never ended.
Yeah. So true. And so because of that, as Christians, as Messianic followers, wherever you're at, we ought to love the Jewish people, considering we are following a Jewish rabbi And all of the disciples, the early disciples, were mainly Jewish. So we ought to love the Jewish people with the heart of God and not, push them aside or say God rejected them. None of this is true. So I think, like you said, end it on a positive note. Go love people. That's what we have to say to you today. Go love everybody. We love you guys so much, and we will see you next week. Bye.